In this video, we're going to create a base paint material. So here I'm going to go to my texture set settings, and we're going to have this base texture set enabled first. So I'm going to solo this just so we can focus on this area here. Now let's close this guy out. Now what I'm going to do is open up my layers, and here I'm just going to dock those to the UI. And then I'm also going to open up my properties here, and let me just left click, tear this off, and just attach that or dock that here into the bottom part of the UI so we have our layers and our properties. Okay, so now that we have our layers palette open, the first thing I'm going to do is create a fill layer. In the UI, I'm going to click the Add Fill Layer button, and that's going to create a fill layer. And so with the fill layer, as I mentioned in a previous video, we have access to all these channels, and the fill layer acts as a container for data that we're going to place into these channels. Now in this case, I'm creating the base layer, so I'm not going to use all of these channels. For example, I'm going to just turn off this height and this normal channel. And I'm going to set a color, so let's come over here to the color, and I'm going to click the swatch, and then I'm just going to come into here and choose like a blue value here, just something that I want to work with. Maybe this value will work. Okay, so I've set this blue color. Right below that, I have this roughness slider, and as I drag this towards white, you can see the surface becomes more rough. It's diffusing more light. If we take the slider and move it towards black, we start to get more of a glossy surface. So I'm just going to keep this, just kind of something close to the middle, maybe around 0.4 or so, because this is just our base layer. So I'm just going to rename this layer to base. Now for the metal, this is going to represent a dielectric or non-metal, so I want to make sure that my metallic slider is set all the way to black. Now there's so many different ways you can approach texturing here in Substance Painter, and the way that I like to work is I like to stay procedural as I work here in the layer stack. And I'll work this way procedurally to get me to about 80 to 90% of the texturing done. This allows me to work non-destructively as well as very quickly. I can also easily reshare materials across texture sets. Then, once about 80 or 90% of the work's done, I can spend the rest of the time just doing hand-painted fine details to really take this asset all the way to 100% completion. And this is the workflow that we're going to follow throughout this course. So I'm going to be using a lot of fill layers. Now, I want to start to introduce some more roughness. So right now, we just have a uniform roughness. If I hit C on the keyboard, this is going to toggle me to channel mode, and here at the top of the UI under my drop down, you can see I'm in the roughness channel. And if I move this slider, you can see that my roughness map is really just a grayscale map. It's going from black to white, and here we have just kind of a mid-gray value. So I'm going to hit M on the keyboard to go back to my material mode, and what I like to do for my roughness is create another fill layer on top of this. Now, I'm going to rename this to rough, and I'm going to come into these channels and disable all the channels except for my roughness. And I'm going to build up a couple layers of rough information using some grunge maps that then is going to be layered back down to my material. And I'm going to do that by using a mask. So to mask a layer here in Substance Painter, we can simply just right-click on the layer, and we can choose to add a white or black mask or a bitmap. In my case, I'm going to use a black mask, black meaning 100% transparent. Now with this mask selected, you can see that it has this blue outline. The UI has dropped right into paint mode, so I can paint directly into a mask. If I select the layer itself, so again I have the blue outline around the fill, you can see the context sensitive properties panel now switches to my fill settings. I'm going to left click on the mask to go back to the mask, and this time I'm going to add a procedural generator. So I'm going to click this Add Effect button and choose Add Generator. Now the generator is empty, so I need to add it. So here I'm going to come over to the generator button. I'm going to click this, and here we have several generators that ship with Substance Painter. I'm going to choose MG Dirt. So now we've had something happening in the viewport. Maybe a little hard to see, so we'll zoom in. Also, we're going to move our light around just so we can see what this roughness is doing. Again, still a little hard to see. So one of the things I could do is hit the C key to drop back into my roughness, and here you can see that we're looking directly at this roughness channel. And so now you can see that we do have some grunge noise appearing here in our roughness, which is modulating that base uniform value that we set here on this base fill layer. So here I'm going to hit M on the keyboard again. Now, because we're modulating this roughness here with a mask, I can also hold down the Alt key and left click my mask so that I could view the results of this mask here in the viewport as well. Notice my viewport's now in mask mode. So here, if I go back to that MG Dirt, you can see that as I start to play around with some of these generator values, we can see that this is procedurally generating a grunge map based on my image inputs that I bake. So things like my curvature and my ambient occlusion. This is the reason why we bake those maps in the previous video, because they're used by things like generators to produce wearing effects like this. So here I can come in and do things like adjust my grunge and so on. Now, another thing that I'm seeing here, I have a UV seam right here in the front of this object. And I want to be able to fix this. So one of the things I can do on this generator is come over here to use triplanar, and I can just turn this on. And so just by turning that on, you can see that I automatically just eliminate that seam that we had. So we don't have to worry about that anymore. And now we have here our roughness that we can control through these generator parameters. So now I'm going to hit M on the keyboard again to go back to my roughness. Okay, so now I'm starting to modulate this roughness, but I still would like to add some more to this. So the more variation we add, the better it's going to look. So I'm going to add another grunge map here to this mask that I'm building. So right now we have our MG Dirt generator, which is building to create this mask. If I hold down the Alt key and left click on this mask, I can view that here in the viewport. And so what we have here is referred to as the effect stack. And I'm going to add another effect to this. So here under Add Effect, I'm going to choose Fill. So now I have another fill. Here in the grayscale button, I'm going to click this. And in the mini shelf, I'm going to do a search for Grunge Scratch. And there's a couple scratch maps in here. And I'm going to use this one here called Grunge Paint Scratched. So I'm going to enable this. Now here you can see we have that seam again. So we can get rid of that by just changing to triplanar projection. And then I'm just going to tile this map. So now we get the level of resolution that I want through the tiling. And then I'm also going to come over here to the procedural parameters for this grunge map, and I'm going to lower the balance so that I really just kind of focusing here on these scratches, maybe increase the contrast. So I'll get something like maybe this here. So right now you can see in my mask, this grunge map is overriding the dirt generator that we had before. So what I can do for each one of these effects is they all have their own blending mode as well as opacity. So here I'm just going to switch the blending mode to max lighten. And then I'll go back and start to tweak or play around here with this balance. So now I'm getting a mix of the dirt generator and this new grunge map to produce this overall mask. So when we view this mask in our material mode, which is again masking this roughness channel, so I'll hit M on the keyboard, now we start to get this result. So now it's just a matter of going back and just playing around with some of these settings to get what we want. So I might do something, again, just kind of check my balance here. Let's see what we have. Now, this mask is also modulating my original base roughness value. So I can go back here to this fill layer and adjust this roughness value as well. So notice now I can choose to make the surface a bit more glossy, but it's still being modulated by that grunge map. Or I could choose to make it a little bit more rough. So this gives me kind of like an overall kind of global controller here for my roughness, yet it's still being modulated here by these grunge maps. So I think I might just try a value something like this here. Now I'll just move my light around just so I can kind of see how the grunge map is going to be affecting this lighting. And I think that's going to take care of my roughness. So now I'd like to use some height information to build up some paint specs. So what I like to do again is I like to keep these on each individual layer. So I'm going to create another fill here. And this time we're going to call this, this will be height, or actually let's just call it paint specs. And let's come in and just disable all of our channels except for just our height. Now we have this height information where we can go towards white or 1, which is going to be like a positive bump, or we can set this towards negative, which is going to be like a negative bump. So here I'm going to set this into the positive direction. Now right now we're not driving this by any actual data other than this slider. So what I'm going to do again is mask this height value with a procedural texture. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to choose to create a black mask. With the mask still selected, I'm going to add an effect, and here I'm going to add a fill. Now let's come over here to the grayscale input, and let's just start to type in, well, we'll just do grunge. Actually here, let's look at another procedural. So I'm going to start to type in procedural, and here we have these black and white spot noises. I'm going to use this black and white spots. Let's go with black and white spots 1. So here you can see that we're starting to get some bumpiness here on the surface. Now we're definitely getting some seam issues, but that's no problem. We can set this projection mode here to triplanar to get rid of that. And we can also come in and start to tile this. So again, if we look at our UV tile, we can get something like this here. Now we have the same situation as before. We're trying to continue to work procedurally with this. So we have a mask. This is the mask that we're creating here for our height channel. And that mask is masking this height value slider that we have here. And like I said, we set this to kind of a positive value, so we're getting this positive bump. So if I start to move this closer to 0, you can see that now, well, the bump effect is being lessened. And if I move it towards the negative, I can now start to create more of a negative bump. So like I said, I still want to keep this positive, but I don't want it to be as intense as it was. So I'm going to keep this height value here closer to the 0 range. And this is exactly what I mean by working procedural. So I have this fill that's modulating everything based on this grunge map, and now I have just this simple kind of uniform slider that allows me to control my intensity value here of this height. Of course, here in Substance Painter, there's always more than one way to do this. So for example, let's say that I had just a set height value. The fill layer is, like I said, a container for these channels. So I could actually go into that container and target a specific channel and then maybe drop its opacity value. So to show you how that works, with this fill layer selected, I'm going to use this drop down here to target my height information. So every time you change this target button, you can see that the blending mode and the opacity is going to change for every channel that's represented inside of this fill layer. Now for height, it automatically defaults to this linear dodge or add mode. But I could come over here to my opacity and just start to lower the opacity, and you can see that gives me kind of the same effect as what I had set up here with masking this height parameter. But again, it always depends on how you want to work. For me, I kind of prefer to just be able to use this kind of global slider here to do that. Okay, so now that I have this set up so far, we have some texture here to this material. I'm going to come back to the mask and go back here to that grunge texture, and I'm going to play around with this histogram position. These are just parameters that are part of this procedural noise. So here you can see that I start to move this position. Now we're starting to just get some of these paint specks here just kind of sporadically placed across the material. And this is more in line of what I wanted to work with. Maybe I'll play around with the disorder just to kind of move this stuff around. So we'll get something like this. Again, just playing around with this histogram position. Okay, so now I have this kind of value. Now I might go back here to my fill layer, and then again, just kind of adjust my height value. Here's a scenario where maybe I'm not getting that fidelity of control that I want from just this slider. See how it's kind of hard to set this value? Well, here I have this numeric value. I could just click in here and then actually type in the value that I want. So I could do that. Or I could also use the opacity mode as like a feather to lessen this. So in my case, again, I have the height channel targeted in this fill layer. So I'm only affecting the opacity for the height information. And now I'll just kind of feather this back a little bit by just playing around with the opacity. So there's another way that you could get just that extra bit of control for what you want to do. So here, again, it's always about just kind of tweaking these values. Let me go back and just do a little bit more increase on that histogram position to get something like this. Okay, so that's going to give me kind of the value that I want to have for this height or bump information. Now at this stage, for our color, we're really only using just one uniform color value. So what I like to do when I'm finished working with targeting this channel here with this drop-down menu, I like to always just quickly set that to base color because I can see my color value here in the thumbnail. So instead of just using this single color value, let's do a mix of a variation of this blue. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to create yet another fill layer. This time I'm going to disable all my channels except for this single color channel. Click this color input to bring up the color picker. Now I'm going to use this little eyedropper here. So I'm going to left click and I'm going to keep my mouse button down. And I'm just going to sample this blue here from the thumbnail like this. So now I'm using the same blue, yet now I can just go and just use that to kind of tweak a little bit of these values like this here. Now, one thing that I want to note about this particular color picker that we have here in Substance Painter. So when you're using the color picker window like this, you're picking values in sRGB. But you'll notice down here, we do have input fields for this. So we have RGB in these input fields. And you'll notice that the values are like very small, 0.027, 0.073. So the way Painter works at this point, or at the recording of this video, is the color picker, like I said, you're choosing this in sRGB, but these input fields are actually in linear values. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're working. Typically, I just use the color picker here or this eyedropper to sample values. Okay, so now that we have that set, what I'm going to do again is mask this. So we're going to right click, we're going to choose a black mask, and with the mask selected, we're going to choose to create another generator, except this time here, we're going to choose this MG mask editor. So I'm going to load up this generator here. Now this has a lot of settings, but don't worry, we're only going to use just a few in this case. So here you'll notice that we have this curvature setting and this curvature value. So I'm going to set this all the way here to 1 like this. Now it's kind of hard to see what's happening. So what I like to do at this stage is Alt left click on my mask so I can see the mask that's being generated here. So now let's go back to that MG mask editor. And we're going to scroll down to where we have curvature. So we've fully activated the curvature control. And now if we click this drop down here, we have access to all of the curvature sliders. So for example, I'm going to change some of these shape sliders and just get rid of some of these values like this here. So I'll get something like this. Now for the actual mode, it's set just the edges, but I'm going to switch this here to dual. So it's going to work with the cavities and the edges. So we'll get something like this here. Now I can start to, again, play around with some of these shape sliders. I also have this softness slider here, so we're going to play with that. Here, I'm going to come up to my global blur and just kind of blur this a bit. So now we have something like this. So with this set, I'm just going to hit M on the keyboard to get back to my material mode. And just so we can really see what's happening, let's go back to our fill layer and let's go into our color. And I'm just going to lift this color value a little bit more. So now you can see that on the edges, we're starting to get a little bit of kind of like a wearing kind of white color. But I think maybe what I want to do is just change this, maybe go something a little darker, something like this here. So I'm going to try to just do this, which is just giving me a little bit variation on this blue color here. And again, I might just go back and just kind of playing around with some of these color values. I think I'm going to tint it a little bit towards green. So now we're getting something like this here, which is more like kind of like a tarnishing color value. And this is happening just on the edges and also in the kind of the cavity areas. Okay, so this kind of gets us to this point, but again, it's always super, super clean. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another grunge on top of this mask editor and then use a blending mode to combine them, just as we did earlier here. So here, I'm going to click my add effect. We're going to add a fill. And then we're going to click our grayscale button here, and let's just do a search again for grunge. And now we're going to try to just find a grunge map that I think might work for this. So here I'm going to try this grunge rust fine. So we'll enable this guy here. And I have this balance control, so we can start to play with this. Also, we're going to want to set this to be triplanar, so we don't have to worry about any seams. We can increase our contrast a bit and we'll just adjust our balance. So we're going to get something like this. And then we're going to come over here to our blending mode and I'm going to try multiply. So now we have that grunge map is starting to kind of eat into some of this edging that we had here. So now I can go back and start to adjust or play around with that balance and contrast setting. So let's do something more like this. Okay, so now I'm getting just a little bit of variation here. Now we're going to go back to that mask editor, and I might come down here into my curvature and then again just start kind of playing around with some of this, just to kind of maybe play with these shape sliders here to just kind of spread this color value a little bit more on the sides. So I just adjusted this medium slider a little bit, something like this, maybe play around with the contrast. Again, we also have this blur towards the top, which can be kind of helpful. So I'm just going to do that. I think I'm just going to blur that a little bit. Okay, so here we have this layer. Let's just name this color var for variation 01. So this is going to be our color variation 1. And let's do this again. So here, in this case, I'm going to just right-click this layer that I have, and I'm just going to duplicate it. So I could also hit Control D, but I'm going to duplicate this layer here. And I'm going to come into here to the mask itself, and I can just hit this close button to remove the effect. And now we're just going to go back into this mask. I'm going to add an effect here. So this time we are going to add a fill, and we're going to come over here to our grayscale button. We're going to click this, and this time I'm going to use this grunge concrete old. So I'm going to just left click to add this. Now again, I'm getting a seam. You can really see it if I zoom into this area here, so we can fix that again by using triplanar. And then I'm going to just change a few settings here. So let's look at our balance and our contrast. So we'll do something like this. So using that same color, we're starting to get this effect. It's all kind of building up. But the reason why I duplicated this and chose to use a different color is because, well, I think I want to try to vary this color as well. So here I'm going to just pick a color and, again, just kind of vary this color just a slight bit here. And then here for the blending mode, I think I might switch this to overlay. And then I'm going to just lower the opacity. Get something like that. So it's just a slight variation there. And then I can come back here to this grunge texture and then once again just play around with this kind of balance setting here. So here I'm just going to start to kind of increase this balance quite a bit to get something like this. So now we've just really kind of modulated these different color values. So we've got our base color. Here we have a color variation 1, and let's rename this layer here to color variation 2. And again, I might just play around just a little bit more with that overlay mode. So I'll drop that around 16 or so. So now we get something like this. So in this video, we started to create our base paint layer. We used some generators and fills within that mask to build up an effects stack so that we could add some variation to the color by simply masking it.